The vibration of the MH-60 Blackhawk was a steady, bone-deep hum that usually lulled Captain Elias Thorne into a tactical trance. Tonight, however, the air felt thin, ionized and sharp, like the moments before a massive electrical storm. Across from him, the cabin light cast a sickly red glow over the faces of his team. 3 teams, Doc said, his voice barely audible over the rotor wash. He was tapping a stylus against his wrist-mounted tablet, staring at a set of erratic wave patterns. Bravo 6, Delta 9, and a Groom Lake research element. All vanished within a 3-mile radius of the maw. No debris, no distress beacons, no bodies. They didn't just go MIA, Cap, they stopped existing. People don't stop existing, Vance countered, checking the wind speed sensor on his long-range optics. They got ambushed. High-wall canyons are a kill box. Maybe some local insurgents found a way to jam the frequencies and took them out in the dark. With what? Doc shot back, looking up. The last transmission from Bravo 6 wasn't a firefight. It was a 30-second audio loop. I ran the spectral analysis. It's a human voice, but the frequency is modulated to a level that would burst a man's lungs. It sounded like a heartbeat being fed through a distortion pedal. Coda, sitting perfectly still with his M249 SAW resting across his knees, looked up. The locals call that place the Wadi al-Zalam, the Valley of Shadows. They won't go within 50 miles of it. They say the sand there remembers things from before the stars were right. Save the campfire stories for the extraction, Coda. Thorne interrupted, his voice a cold rasp. He leaned forward, eyes locking onto each of them. Command isn't worried about ghosts. They're worried about the pulse. Every 48 hours, this canyon emits a burst of electromagnetic energy that fries every satellite passing overhead. It's localized, it's precise, and it's growing. Our job isn't to play detective. We find the source, we tag it for an airstrike, and we find out what happened to our boys. We are a recovery and demolition element, nothing more. The pilot's voice cut through the internal comms. Canyon entrance in sight, dropping to 20 feet for fast rope. Be advised, my instruments are starting to drift. My compass is spinning like a top. I'm not staying in the hole for more than 60 seconds. Copy that, Thorne said, standing up and grabbing the thick nylon rope. Go dark, goggles on. They slid down into the throat of the canyon. The heat hit them first, a dry, suffocating weight, followed by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. As the Blackhawk pulled away, its sound vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the towering, jagged limestone walls that rose 600 feet into the air. Thorne signaled for a diamond formation. They moved deeper into the maw, their infrared strobes blinking silently on their helmets. The canyon floor was littered with fine white silt that didn't crunch under their boots. It felt soft, like walking on powdered bone. Vance, leading the point, suddenly signaled a halt. He dropped to a crouch, his rifle leveled at a shallow alcove in the rock. Movement, Thorne whispered. No, Vance replied, his voice tight. Evidence. Thorne moved up. In the alcove sat a standard-issue military rucksack. It was perfectly intact, resting on a flat stone as if someone had simply set it down to take a break. Thorne recognized the markings. B6. Bravo 6. He opened the main compartment. Inside was a GPS unit, a half-eaten MRE, and a family photo. "The gear is clean," Vance noted, his laser sight dancing over the surrounding walls. "No blood, no signs of a struggle. It's like he just walked away from his life." "Cap," Coda called out from the rear, "you need to see this." On the opposite wall, 10 feet above the ground, were the marks. They were tactical breach symbols, the kind used to mark a room as clear, but they were gouged deep into the ancient stone. The limestone was scarred with long, vertical furrows, as if a massive, multi-fingered hand had dragged a man upward into the dark. "Doc, check the Geiger," Thorne ordered, his pulse finally starting to quicken. Doc pulled out a sensor. "Radiation is baseline, but the magnetism. Cap, the needle is jumping. It's rhythmic. Every 3 seconds it spikes and drops, like a pulse." As if responding to the word, the ground beneath them gave a subtle, nauseating heave. A low, thrumming sound began to emanate from the walls, a vibration that Thorne felt in his teeth. "Wind's picking up," Coda said, bracing himself. It wasn't a normal wind. The air didn't blow past them. It began to spiral. The white silt on the floor rose in a perfect localized vortex circling the team. It grew with impossible speed, turning from a light dust into a screaming wall of white. "Flashlights on!" Thorne yelled, but the white sand was too thick. It reflected the light back into their eyes, blinding them. The sound was the worst part. Within the roar of the wind, there were voices, hundreds of them, overlapping in a dissonant, wet clicking. Thorne reached out to grab Coda's shoulder, but his hand met only empty, freezing air. The gravity in the canyon seemed to invert. For a terrifying second, Thorne felt weightless, as if he were being pulled through a straw. Then, the world slammed back into focus. The wind vanished. The heat was gone, replaced by a stagnant, damp chill. Thorne fell to his knees, gasping for air that tasted of salt and old copper. He blinked, wiping the white grit from his goggles, and stood up. They were no longer in the canyon. The sky above was a swirling, bruised gray, devoid of stars or moon. They stood in the center of a wide plaza paved with the same white, porous stone. Surrounding them was a village that defied every law of architecture Thorne knew. The buildings were tall, spindly things, leaning at impossible angles, built from a material that looked like calcified remains. There were no windows, only dark, narrow slits in the bone-white walls. "Vance? Coda? Doc?" Thorne called out, his rifle tucked into his shoulder. One by one, they emerged from the gloom, their weapons raised, their movements jerky and disoriented. "Where the hell are we?" Doc whispered, his voice trembling. "My HUD says we haven't moved, but we're in a city." "Not a city," Coda said, pointing his SAW toward the shadows between the leaning towers. "A kennel." From the dark slits of the buildings, the first of them appeared. They were gray, spindly figures with limbs that were too long and skin that hung loose like wet parchment. They had no eyes, only smooth, pale skin where their sockets should be, and their mouths were stitched shut with dark, fibrous thread. They didn't move like people. They moved like puppets being jerked by invisible strings. Thorne watched as dozens, Then hundreds of the gray things seeped out of the bone-white stone. They didn't attack. They simply stood there, their heads tilting in unison, listening to the rhythmic thrumming that was now loud enough to shake the very ground they stood on. "Don't fire," Thorn commanded, his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart. "Not until I give the word. We need to find a way out of this circle." But as they backed away, the buildings themselves seemed to shift, the narrow alleys closing like teeth. The village that wasn't there was now the only world that existed. The village didn't just sit on the land. It felt grown, like a sprawling, calcified fungus that had erupted from the desert floor. The team stood in a tight diamond formation, boots scraping against the porous white pavement. The silence here was different than the canyons. It was a heavy, expectant pressure, like the air inside a tomb just before the lid is sealed. "They aren't breathing," Doc whispered, his voice cracking. He was looking at his biometric scanner, then back at the pale, spindly figures lining the rooftops and alleyways. "Cap, I'm picking up thermal signatures, but there's no respiratory rhythm, no heartbeat. It's like they're running on an external power source." "The pulse," Thorn muttered. He looked at the villagers. They were dressed in rags that had long since bleached to the color of salt, their skin a translucent, bruised gray. They stood perfectly still, their eyeless faces all angled toward the team as if sensing the heat of their blood. "Vance, find us a bottleneck. We can't fight them in the open if they decide to swarm." Vance scanned the twisted architecture. Southwest, there's a structure with a narrow entrance and a heavy stone lintel. It looks like a temple or a storehouse. If we can get inside, we can funnel them. "Move," Thorn ordered. The team retreated toward the building, their rifles raised. For every step they took, the villagers took one in return. A synchronized, jerky movement that sounded like 1,000 dry sticks snapping at once. They didn't run. They drifted, their long, needle-thin fingers twitching at their sides. As they reached the threshold of the stone structure, the rhythmic thrumming of the ground reached a crescendo. The sky above pulsed with a sickly violet light. Suddenly, the first villager moved with a speed that defied its gaunt frame. It lunged from a rooftop, falling toward Coda with its mouth, still stitched shut with black thread, stretching wide as the fibers groaned under the tension. Coda didn't flinch. He brought the saw up and fired a short, controlled burst. The rounds punched through the creature's chest, sending sprays of black, viscous fluid onto the white stone. The creature hit the ground, rolled, and immediately began to crawl toward them, its broken limbs snapping back into place with a sickening wet sound. "Headshots only!" Thorn roared, his own rifle barking as he dropped a second attacker. "They're not using their organs. Destroy the motor functions." They scrambled inside the building. It was a cavernous hall, the walls lined with alcoves containing jars made of human bone. In the center of the room sat a shallow pit filled with the same white sand that had transported them here. "Doc, bar the door," Thorn commanded. Doc and Vance shoved a massive slab of petrified wood across the entrance, the weight of it nearly crushing their hands. Outside, the clicking sound grew louder. It wasn't just teeth anymore. It was the sound of hundreds of fingernails scratching against the stone walls, searching for a gap, a crack, a way in. "We're trapped," Doc said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He began setting up a perimeter of motion sensors, his hands shaking. "The satellite link is still dead. We're in a literal blind spot in the universe." Thorne ignored the panic in Doc's voice. He was looking at the back of the hall, where a set of stairs descended into a pitch-black basement. The thrumming was coming from down there. It felt like the village had a heart, and they were standing right above the aorta. "We aren't trapped," Thorne said, his eyes hard and cold. "We're exactly where we need to be. These things are servants. They're protecting something. Coda, Vance, check the jars. I want to know what they've been sacrificing to this god." Vance approached one of the bone jars and tipped the lid with his combat knife. He recoiled instantly, the copper scent of fresh blood filling the room. Inside was a collection of dog tags, dozens of them, tangled in a mess of hair and gray skin. "Bravo 6, Vance whispered, pulling a set of tags from the jar. "And Delta 9. They didn't just kill them, Cap. They harvested them." Before Thorne could respond, the ceiling above them groaned. Dust filtered down in fine white plumes. The scratching outside had stopped, replaced by a low melodic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of their bones. "They're on the roof," Coda warned, his SAW leveled upward. The bone-white stone of the ceiling began to liquefy, turning into a viscous, dripping sludge. The villagers weren't breaking in. They were melting through the architecture itself. The ceiling didn't just break. It gave way like a healing scab being torn from a wound. The bone-white slurry dripped onto the floor, and with it came the villagers. They didn't fall so much as they descended, their elongated limbs clinging to the shifting stone as if they were part of the structure itself. "Contacts above!" Vance screamed. He was the first to open fire. The sharp, rhythmic cracks of his DMR echoed through the vaulted hall, each shot finding the skull of a descending creature. The villagers' heads snapped back, gray matter and black ichor splashing against the pale walls. But the sheer volume of bodies was overwhelming. For every one that Vance dropped, 3 more seeped through the liquefying stone. "Doc, Coda, back to back," Thorne barked, his M4 spitting fire as he cleared a path toward the center of the hall. "Conserve your rounds, short bursts." Coda let out a low, guttural roar as he let the saw sing. The heavy machine gun chewed through the front line of the pale servants, severing limbs and bisection torsos. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a mechanical cacophony that temporarily drowned out the rhythmic thrumming of the village. But the villagers were relentless. They didn't feel pain, and they didn't fear death. One creature, missing its entire lower jaw, lunged at Coda, its needle-like fingers digging into the gaps of his tactical vest. "Get off him!" Doc yelled, swinging his carbine like a club to knock the creature aside before finishing it with a burst to the neck. "They're coming through the floor now," Vance shouted. The white sand in the central pit began to churn, rising like a tide. Pale, spindly hands reached out of the grit, grasping at the air. The team was being squeezed from above and below. "The basement!" Thorne shouted, pointing toward the dark stairwell. "It's the only way out. Move!" They began a fighting retreat. Vance stayed on the flank, his precision fire keeping the swarming masses at bay. Coda walked backward, his SAW creating a wall of lead that kept the path clear. They were 20 feet from the stairs when the god pulsed again. The vibration was so violent it knocked Doc to his knees. The violet light in the sky, visible through the melting roof, flared with blinding intensity. In that second of disorientation, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch and solidify. A figure taller than the rest, its skin darker and its limbs ending in serrated bone, emerged from the gloom behind Vance. "Vance, 6 o'clock!" Thorne screamed, but the roar of Coda's saw muffled the warning. The creature's hand moved with the speed of a whip. It didn't grab Vance. It transfixed him. A bone spur protruding from the creature's palm drove through Vance's shoulder, pinning him to the wall. "Vance!" Coda turned, his machine gun stuttering to a halt as he reached for his friend. "Don't stop!" Vance gasped, his face turning a sickly, translucent gray as the creature's touch seemed to drain the color from his skin. He reached for a grenade on his chest rig, his fingers fumbling with the pin. "Go! Get to the source. End this." "Vance, no!" Doc started forward, but Thorne caught his collar, hanking him back toward the stairs. "He's gone, Doc. Move." Thorne's voice was a jagged edge of grief and command. Vance looked at Thorne one last time, a grim, bloody smile pulling at his lips. He pulled the pin. The explosion rocked the hall, the concussive force throwing the remaining team members down the first few steps of the stairwell. Dust and bone shrapnel filled the air. When the smoke cleared, the entrance to the hall was a ruin of fire and collapsed stone. Vance was gone, taking a dozen of the Skinwalker servants with him. Thorne, Coda, and Doc scrambled down the stairs into the darkness, the sounds of the surviving villagers scratching at the rubble behind them. The air in the basement was colder, smelling of ancient copper and ozone. As they reached the bottom, their tactical lights cut through the dark, revealing not a basement, but a massive subterranean cavern. In the center of the cavern sat the heart of the village. It was a monolith of obsidian, 30 feet tall, pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly violet light. Around its base, hundreds of human skeletons were arranged in a perfect geometric sunburst. "This is it," Doc whispered, his voice trembling as he checked his sensor. "The source of the pulse. It's not a machine, Cap. It's a lung. It's breathing." "Then we're here to perform a lung transplant," Thorne said, reaching for the C4 charges in his pack. "Coda, Doc, set a perimeter. We don't have much time before they find another way down." But the scratching above had stopped. The cavern grew deathly silent. From the shadows behind the monolith, a voice whispered, not in their ears, but directly inside their minds. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "The tithe has been paid. Why do you bring fire to the altar?" The voice didn't vibrate the air. It vibrated their teeth. It was a cold, oily sensation that made Doc drop his rifle and clutch his temples, a thin line of blood beginning to leak from his nose. "Don't listen to it," Thorne roared, his voice acting as a tether to reality. "Coda, Doc, eyes on the shadows. We are the fire." The obsidian monolith groaned, the violet light within it shifting from a rhythmic pulse to a jagged, frantic strobe. From the dark recesses of the cavern, more than just the servants emerged. These were the ancients, creatures that stood 8 feet tall, their bodies a horrific fusion of human anatomy and distorted geometry. They didn't walk, they glided, their movements leaving trails of after-images in the stagnant air. "Perimeter!" Coda shouted, slamming the bipod of his SAW onto a flat-topped sacrificial altar. "I'll hold the left flank. Doc, get your head in the game." Doc shook off the mental static, his training taking over. He moved to the right, bracing his carbine against a pillar of calcified bone. "I've got the right. Cap, if you're going to blow this thing, do it now. My sensors are screaming. The energy buildup is going to liquefy our internal organs if we stay here another 5 minutes." Thorn scrambled to the base of the monolith. The stone was freezing, so cold it burned his fingertips through his tactical gloves. He began slapping blocks of C4 onto the obsidian surface, his movements a blur of practiced muscle memory. He wired the detonators, his mind screaming at him to look back, to check on his men. But he knew that every second he spent looking was a second he wasn't arming the end of this nightmare. Behind him, the cavern erupted into a symphony of violence. Coda's SAW was a continuous roar, the muzzle flash illuminating the pale, eyeless faces of the encroaching horde. "Come on!" Coda bellowed, his voice thick with a warrior's defiance. "Is that all you've got? I've seen scarier things in a bottle of whiskey." But the ancients were clever. One of them didn't attack directly. It moved through the ceiling, its body phasing in and out of the rock. It dropped directly onto Doc. "Cap! Coda!" Doc's scream was cut short as a serrated bone blade pierced his chest from collarbone to hip. "Doc!" Coda turned, his fire slacking for a fatal second. In that heartbeat, the villagers swarmed. They didn't use weapons. They used their weight, hundreds of them throwing themselves onto Coda like a gray, suffocating blanket. The machine gun fell silent, buried under a mountain of twitching, pale limbs. Thorn heard the wet snap of bone and Coda's final, muffled grunt of pain. Thorn was alone. He jammed the final blasting cap into the C4. His hands were covered in his own blood from the jagged obsidian edges. He reached for the remote detonator, but a shadow fell over him. The tall, dark creature that had killed Vance stood before him, its stitched mouth stretching into a horrific, silent mimicry of a smile. "You are the last," the voice echoed in his skull. "The god demands a heart of iron. Yours will suffice." Thorn looked at the creature, then at the dead eyes of his brothers scattered across the cavern floor. He didn't feel fear. He felt a cold, crystalline rage that burned hotter than any sun. "My heart's a little heavy for your god," Thorn whispered. He gripped the detonator. "It's full of C4. He didn't wait for a response. He dove backward into the central sandpit just as his thumb depressed the trigger. The world didn't just explode, it inverted. The obsidian monolith shattered into a million razor-sharp shards, and the violet light within expanded into a supernova of pure kinetic energy. The villagers let out a collective, ear-piercing shriek. A sound of true, mortal agony as the source of their immortality was vaporized. Then came the wind. Another sandstorm, more violent than the first, erupted from the heart of the explosion. Thorn felt himself being flayed, the white sand stripping the consciousness from his mind. He was falling again, tumbling through a void where time had no meaning. Thorn woke to the sound of a real wind. He was lying on his back, staring up at a sky that was a deep, honest indigo. The stars were where they were supposed to be. The air smelled of dry dust and heat, not salt and decay. He coughed, a cloud of white silt rising from his lungs, and looked around. He was back in the maw of Alkali. He was alone. His gear was shredded, his weapons gone, and his body was a map of bruises and cuts. But he was breathing. He crawled to his feet, his legs shaking. He checked his wrist terminal. It had been 6 minutes since they had dropped into the canyon. To the world, his team had never even reached the first mile. 3 days later, Thorn stood in a windowless briefing room at a black site in Oman. His chain of command sat across from him, their faces masks of disbelief. "You're telling us the entire team was lost to a village of ghosts?" the general asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "And you destroyed this god with 4 blocks of C4? "I didn't destroy it," Thorn said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He leaned over the table, his eyes boring into the general's. "I evicted it. I broke its house. But that thing is still down there beneath the sand, and it's angry." The general sighed. "And what exactly are you proposing, Captain? We've already lost 3 teams." Thorn reached into his pocket and pulled out a single jagged shard of obsidian that had been embedded in his armor. It pulsed with a faint, dying violet light. "I'm proposing we go back," Thorn said. "Not with a recon team. I want a combat engineer platoon, a thermobaric strike package, and every man I can handpick. We aren't going there to investigate." He gripped the shard until his knuckles turned white. "We're going back to kill a god. And this time, I'm bringing a bigger hammer."